The horse-drawn conveyance had disappeared over the rise an hour prior, yet Honora remained standing in the snow, her gaze fixed on the barren horizon where the wooden structure had vanished like a phantom into the pale December sky. Beside her, 7-year-old Celia clung to her mother's skirt, her small hand tightly gripping the worn fabric with a tenacity that had not wavered since her father's departure. The wind swept across the plateau of the Montana Territory with a mournful cry, seeming to articulate all the unspoken sentiments Honora held within, carrying with it the foretelling of further snowfall and the stark reality of the cost of survival. Silas had taken everything: the wagon, its canvas cover, patched but still functional, the pair of horses, dependable beasts that had carried them across half a continent, the provisions intended to sustain them until Oregon, the sacks of flour and beans, the salted pork, the tools, the rifle, the warm quilts Honora had painstakingly sewn during their courtship. He had left them with naught but the garments on their backs, a solitary thin wool blanket that had been airing on a bush when he'd made his decision, and words that still seared Honora's memory with the intensity of a brand. "I never desired this life for either of you. You were both errors I am done rectifying." He had uttered these words with a chilling composure, devoid of any particular animosity, as if discussing the atmospheric conditions or the state of the path ahead. This very calmness, however, had exacerbated the sting. Had he been enraged, had he been intoxicated, had there been any palpable heat to his desertion, Honora might have found a means to comprehend it. But his frigid logic, his matter-of-fact repudiation of his wife and child, inflicted a wound far deeper than any fury could. The December sun hung low and pallid, offering illumination but no comfort, a faint white circle against a sky the hue of aged pewter. Honora glanced down at her daughter's upturned face. Those wide brown eyes brimmed with questions that warranted better answers than reality could offer. Celia possessed her father's dark hair, but her mother's features, and Honora found herself grateful for this minor solace. She gently stroked Celia's hair with fingers already stiffened by the cold, forcing her own frozen expression into a semblance of fortitude, something that might project confidence in a child's gaze. "We will be all right," Honora declared. And in that moment, by voicing it aloud, she willed it into truth. The words hung suspended in the frigid air, crystallizing like her breath, and she repeated them with renewed conviction. "We will be all right, Celia. I promise you." "Where did Papa go?" Celia's voice, small and uncertain, threaded through the wind's mournful howl. "Away," Honora responded simply. There would be time for more complete explanations later, assuming they survived. "It is just us now, my darling girl. Just you and me." They had been traveling with Silas's wagon train for 2 days when he abandoned them, placing them perhaps 15 miles from the last settlement they had passed and 30 or more from the next. The landscape unfurled in every direction, an endless panorama of snow-laden hills interspersed with stands of pine and stark, skeletal cottonwoods. To retrace their steps meant certain demise from the elements. Honora knew they would never manage 15 miles through deep snow with no sustenance and inadequate attire. To venture forward presented the same grim calculus. Yet stillness was not inherent in Honora's nature. It never had been, not even when remaining stationary might have been the more prudent course. She had noticed the dark opening of the cave the previous evening when they were still a party of 3, husband, wife, and child, traveling together in the fragile pretense of a family unit. It had appeared as a mere shadow against the limestone cliff face, approximately 1 mile to the north, partially concealed by a grove of pines that seemed to stand as guardians of its entrance. At the time, it had registered merely as a point of interest, one of the many geological features defining this rugged terrain. Now it represented a potential, perhaps their sole possibility. "Can you walk a little further, my darling girl?" Honora inquired, her mind already assessing the distance and the remaining daylight. Celia nodded, though her lips had taken on a bluish hue that instilled in Honora a fear she carefully concealed. They set off across the snow, Honora carrying the blanket in one arm and Celia in the other, whenever the drifts became too profound for the child's short legs. The young girl's body felt remarkably light, burdened by hunger and youth, a precious bundle that Honora held close to her own form for warmth. The wind pressed against them, as if testing their resolve, and Honora pushed back, leaning into its force with every stride. The journey consumed nearly an hour. By the time they reached the cliff face, Honora's arms ached and her lungs burned from the frigid air, but they had arrived, and the cave's maw stood before them, darker and more promising than it had seemed from afar. The cave opening was taller than Honora had initially estimated, perhaps 8 feet in height and of similar width. She gently set Celia down and peered into the gloom. The interior extended back into the hillside, the ceiling ascending to accommodate what appeared to be a spacious chamber. The ground within was dry, strewn with desiccated leaves and the bones of small creatures. There were no recent tracks, nor any scent of bear or feline. The cave had been unoccupied for some time. "Is this where we will stay?" Celia asked, her voice a mere whisper against the wind's roar. "Yes," Honora confirmed. "This is where we will establish our home." That first night, they huddled together beneath the single blanket, listening to the wind shriek past the cave's entrance. Honora did not sleep. She planned. When the morning light filtered into the cave, Honora rose with resolute purpose. She had been a farmer's daughter before becoming Silas's wife, and her father had instilled in her the principle that survival comprised a series of small, practical determinations made sequentially until one emerged from hardship. "We require a fire," she told Celia. "Can you assist me in gathering kindling?" The woods bordering the cliff face provided dry branches and bark. Honora's fingers, already chapped from the cold, bled as she peeled birch bark and snapped twigs. Celia, with a determined expression on her small face, dragged larger branches through the snow. Together, they assembled a pile near the cave's entrance, where the smoke could dissipate. Fire proved to be the most formidable challenge of those initial days. Honora possessed no flint, no steel, no matches. She had observed her father ignite a fire through friction once, years ago, when she was barely older than Celia was now. He had made it appear simple, almost effortless, as skilled individuals often do with tasks they have mastered. However, Honora had never attempted it herself, nor had she ever been compelled to. And now, the knowledge felt as if viewed through a mist, present yet indistinct. She gathered the driest wood she could find, grateful that the cave had offered shelter to some fallen branches from the snow. She required a fireboard and a spindle. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. The wood had to be suitable, neither excessively hard nor too soft. Cedar was ideal, or cottonwood. She selected a piece of dead cottonwood that felt promising, its bark already beginning to peel. For hours she labored. With a sharp stone she carved a small depression into the fireboard, then began to rotate the spindle between her palms, applying downward pressure to generate friction. With each rotation, her hands moved up the spindle, then quickly returned to the top to recommence the process over and over with increasing speed. The motion appeared straightforward. The reality was arduous. Her palms blistered within the first hour. The blisters ruptured, her hands bled. The blood mingled with wood dust and her own perspiration, despite the frigid temperatures. Celia watched with unwavering faith, never doubting her mother's eventual success, a faith that served as both a comfort and a burden. What if she failed? What if they perished from the cold, due to her deficiency in this singular, essential skill? "Tell me about the farm, Mama," Celia murmured softly. "Tell me about when you were little." So Honora spoke while she worked, her voice maintaining a rhythm with her hands. She recounted summers in Ohio, her father's fields of corn growing tall and verdant, her mother's kitchen garden overflowing with tomatoes and beans. She described the cool spring house where they kept milk and butter, the hen house where she gathered eggs each morning, the barn cat that produced endless litters of kittens whom she and her sisters had affectionately named and cherished. She spoke, and her hands moved, and the spindle spun, and slowly, so very slowly, the wood began to warm. After what felt like an eternity, a faint wisp of smoke curled upward from the depression in the fireboard. Honora's heart leaped, but she did not cease. She could not. She continued rotating the spindle, maintaining consistent pressure until a small ember glowed red within the accumulated wood dust. With trembling, bloodied hands, she carefully transferred the ember to a prepared nest of shredded bark and dry grass. She brought the nest close to her face and blew gently, steadily, tears streaming down her cheeks from the smoke, from relief, and from sheer emotional exhaustion. The grass smoldered, then smoked more heavily. A tiny flame licked at the bark, then another, and then, miraculously and anciently, fire bloomed in her hands. Celia clapped her small hands together, a sound akin to bird wings in the cave's quietude. Honora, with great care and reverence, transferred the burning nest to the pile of kindling they had gathered. She fed it meticulously, adding larger pieces as the flames intensified. Within minutes, they possessed a genuine fire, crackling and warm, pushing back the shadows and the cold. Honora sank back on her heels and wept. These were not delicate tears, but great heaving sobs that racked her entire body. She cried for the marriage that had failed, for the man who had abandoned his family, for the terror of the past 2 days, for the pain in her hands and the chill in her bones. And she cried with relief and pride because she had accomplished this seemingly impossible feat, bringing fire into existence with nothing but wood and unwavering determination. Celia crawled into her mother's lap, and together they sat before the flames, absorbing the heat, the light, and the hope. They had fire. Over the ensuing days, Honora worked with methodical intensity to seal the cave entrance against the wind without obstructing ventilation for light and smoke. Using branches that Celia diligently dragged in, she constructed a framework across the cave mouth, weaving smaller branches between them to form a rough lattice. Into the gaps, she packed dried grass, leaves, and pine needles. "It's like a wall," Celia remarked, observing her mother's labor. "It's better than a wall," Honora replied, tying another branch into place with strips torn from her dress hem. "It breathes." Water was obtained from snow melted in a flat stone they had discovered within the cave, heated near the fire until it steamed and then consumed warm. It tasted of stone and smoke, but it was pure, and it was theirs. Sustenance presented a more significant challenge, a problem that occupied Honora's thoughts during every waking moment of those initial weeks. She had never engaged in trapping before, nor had she ever found it necessary, but necessity proved to be an excellent instructor. She studied the snow surrounding the cave entrance with a new keenness, learning to decipher the narratives it conveyed. Rabbit tracks were ubiquitous, small prints arranged in pairs, hopping patterns that led to and from burrows in the earth where these creatures sought refuge. Fox tracks were also present, larger and more deliberate, and once she observed the enormous splayed prints of a mountain lion, a discovery that sent her heart racing and her priorities shifting. She needed to protect Celia. She needed to render them less vulnerable. The snares were fashioned from the brass wire stays of her corset, painstakingly pried free with bleeding fingers and shaped into loops. She had watched her father set snares for rabbits during lean times. She recalled the fundamental principle, a loop suspended in a path, triggered by the animal's movement. However, remembering and executing proved to be vastly different endeavors. Her initial 3 snares yielded nothing. The 4th caught and lost a rabbit. She discovered the sprung snare with tufts of gray fur caught in the loop, tangible evidence of her near success. The 5th snare secured a young rabbit firmly, and Honora dispatched it quickly, whispering an apology to the small creature that would grant them a few more days of life. She had never skinned an animal before, nor had she ever closely observed her father or brothers perform the task, but she had witnessed it, and she had no alternative but to attempt it. The process was more arduous and messy than she had imagined, more intimately involved. By the time she finished, her hands were coated in blood, and her dress was irrevocably ruined. But she possessed meat, precious, life-sustaining meat and a pelt that would offer a modicum of warmth. She instructed Celia on how to interpret the tracks, crouching beside her daughter in the snow and pointing out the significant details. See how the hind prints land ahead of the front prints? That's how you know it's a rabbit. They hop, so their stronger hind legs propel them forward and land first. And see how the prints lead from this brush pile to that tree? That's a run. Rabbits use the same paths repeatedly, much like we use roads. They feel more secure on familiar ground. Celia absorbed everything with a seriousness that belied her years. She posed questions that demonstrated genuine comprehension. If they use the same paths, won't they learn to avoid our snares? Honora had to admit her uncertainty, but together they devised strategies, frequently relocating the snares, setting them in different positions along the runs, utilizing minuscule amounts of their scarce provisions to create bait stations that lured the rabbits to new locations. The first rabbit was followed by a second, and then a third. Honora became more proficient at skinning, wasting less meat, and inflicting less damage on the pelts. She discovered that rabbit organs, while not palatable, were edible and surprisingly nutritious. The bones, roasted until brittle, could be crushed and added to hot water to create a thin but fortifying broth. Nothing could be wasted, not even the smallest fragment. She fashioned needles from the bones, smoothing them with stones and piercing eyes with the tip of her knife, the sole implement she had possessed in her pocket when Silas departed, and therefore their only tool. She created thread from sinew, painstakingly separating the fibers and twisting them together. Her stitches were crude initially, large and uneven, but they held. She sewed the rabbit pelts together, edge to edge, constructing a growing fur blanket that retained heat far more effectively than their single wool one. "You are clever, Mama," Celia remarked one evening, watching Honora work by the firelight. "I am desperate," Honora corrected, then smiled to soften the words. "But thank you, my darling girl. Necessity makes us all clever." As days melded into weeks, and the cave gradually transformed from mere shelter into something approximating a home, Honora developed systems for every aspect of their existence. She constructed a raised sleeping platform from branches lashed together with sinew, elevating their bed from the frigid floor, where the temperature plummeted most acutely at night. The construction took 3 days and left her with sore muscles and new calluses atop old blisters. But when she and Celia slept on it that first night, elevated and insulated, the difference was remarkable. She wove mats from dried grass and pine needles, creating insulation beneath the blanket that now covered a bed frame of lashed branches. The rabbit pelts accumulated, and she stitched them together with sinew and bone needles, creating a second blanket that carried a wild scent but retained heat like a blessing. The cave walls themselves became functional. Honora discovered that the limestone was soft enough to carve with harder stones, and she created niches in the rock face for storing their meager possessions, the bone tools, the few roots and nuts they had scavenged, the supply of tinder kept dry for the fire. Celia proved an incapable assistant. She learned to tend the fire, adding wood in small quantities to maintain a steady flame. She helped scrape the rabbit hides, her small fingers working the skins until they became supple. She collected pine pitch, which Honora used to waterproof their wind barrier and seal cracks in the stone. The child who had once been sheltered and protected was evolving into a self-reliant, capable and strong individual. "Mama," Celia said one evening as they sat by the fire, "are we poor?" Honora surveyed their cave. The fire cast dancing shadows on the walls. Their bed platform was sturdy, covered with grass mats and fur. Stone niches held their meticulously organized provisions. The wind barrier repelled the worst of the cold. Outside, snow fell in heavy curtains, but within they were warm and fed. "No, my darling girl," Honora stated, "we are not poor. We are rich in what truly matters." As winter deepened, Honora expanded their survival systems. She dug a cold storage pit at the rear of the cave, where the temperature remained just above freezing. Here she stored snow-packed meat from the rabbits she caught with increasing regularity. She constructed a drying rack near the fire for preserving meat and any edible plants she could locate. The cave ceiling became a repository for hanging bundles of dried grasses, medicinal herbs she recognized from her childhood, and strips of meat curing in the smoke. She carved a channel in the floor to direct water seepage away from their living area, leading it to a depression that served as a catch basin. Celia learned to read the weather by observing the smoke from their fire. When it ascended straight and steady, the weather would remain fair. When it swirled and pushed back into the cave, a storm was imminent. She learned to identify animal tracks in the snow, distinguishing those of rabbits from squirrels from foxes. She learned which stones would spark against each other, which wood burned hot and which burned long, which plants were edible and which should be avoided. "You are becoming a mountain woman," Honora told her daughter one morning, watching Celia efficiently reset a snare. "Is that what we are now?" Celia inquired. "Mountain women." "I suppose we are," Honora replied. "We are whatever we need to be." The most challenging periods occurred during the most intense cold, when temperatures plummeted to such extremes that water froze solid even within the cave and their breath formed invisible clouds. Honora would draw Celia close, enveloping them both in the rabbit fur blanket, and tell stories. She spoke of her childhood on the farm, of the changing seasons and the harvest, of how the world would appear when spring finally arrived. She recounted fairy tales and fables, adventures and romances, anything to fill the frozen hours. Celia, too, told stories, inventing elaborate narratives about the animals they tracked, bestowing upon them names and families. The rabbit they had caught became Lord Thistle Whisker, a noble creature. The fox, whose tracks they had observed, transformed into Lady Redbrush, elegant and cunning. On Christmas Eve, Honora carved a small figure from pine wood, a rudimentary angel lacking extended wings. She placed it in one of the wall niches, and together she and Celia sang every carol they could recall. Their voices resonated off the stone walls, and for a fleeting moment the cave felt like a sanctuary, sacred and secure. "I miss Papa," Celia murmured softly after the singing ceased. Honora drew her daughter nearer. She would not deceive her. "I know you do, my darling girl. Will he return?" "No," Honora replied, "but we do not need him to. We have each other, and we have this." She gestured around the cave, encompassing everything they had constructed. "We created this ourselves." January ushered in the harshest winter conditions. Snow piled 6 feet deep outside the cave entrance, and for 3 days they were confined to their shelter. Honora worried about their meat supply, about the snares buried beneath the snow, about whether they had sufficient firewood, but she did not allow Celia to perceive her apprehension. Instead, they engaged in games, created shadow puppets on the cave wall, and practiced arithmetic using pebbles. Honora taught Celia to read using the small Bible that had been in her pocket when Silas left. They read Genesis, and the narrative of creation and new beginnings seemed fitting. When the tempest finally subsided, they ventured out to discover their surroundings reshaped into surreal formations of snow and ice. 3 of their traps had withstood the elements, and by the afternoon they possessed fresh provisions. Honora began to contemplate matters beyond mere survival. She utilized charcoal from their fire to sketch designs on the cave walls, outlining future improvements. These included a more robust entrance barrier, a proper chimney for smoke redirection, built-in storage ledges, and a table and seating carved from logs when warmer weather permitted. "Will we be residing here indefinitely?" Celia inquired, observing her mother's artistic endeavors. "I cannot speak for forever," Honora replied, "but we shall remain for as long as necessary. This is our dwelling now." And indeed, it had become a home. Honora had imposed order upon disarray, created sanctuary from exposure, and established security from desolation. Every enhancement to their cavernous abode served as an act of defiance against Silas's tyranny, against the winter's fury, and against a world that had written them off as expendable. Their refuge had transformed into a testament to the capabilities of a determined woman and her child when necessity demanded resourcefulness. February introduced subtle indications of an approaching shift in seasons. The sun commenced its ascent slightly earlier each day, and its descent occurred a little later. The snow, though still abundant, developed a surface crust that could, at times, support their weight. Honora ventured further afield from their shelter, inspecting the snares she had strategically placed throughout the adjacent woodlands. She encountered a frozen waterway and noted its position, recognizing its significance as a future source of potable water once the thaw commenced. One afternoon, Celia made a remarkable discovery. Towards the rear of the cave, where the ceiling descended and the darkness became absolute, she found what appeared to be age-old markings upon the stone. There were hand impressions rendered in red ochre, depictions of fauna, and symbols whose origins had been lost to the passage of time. "Mother, please come and see," she called, and Honora crawled back to investigate. They examined the etchings illuminated by the flickering light of a torch fashioned from pine resin and desiccated grass. Someone dwelled here previously, or at the very least, sought refuge within. Someone endured in this place and left their imprint. We should contribute our own mark as well, Celia declared. Consequently, Honora combined charcoal with rendered rabbit fat, concocting a dark pigment. She traced Celia's hand on the wall, adjacent to the ancient illustrations, then her own hand beside it. Below, she inscribed with a sharp stone, "Honora and Celia, winter of 1882 to 1883. We persevered. As March dawned, the cave had evolved into a surprisingly comfortable living space. The sleeping platform was laden with furs and dried grasses, offering a level of softness conducive to restful slumber. The hearth was bordered with stones that retained and radiated heat long after the embers had faded. Honora had fashioned rudimentary clay vessels from mud procured from a secluded gully, which she then hardened in the coals. Crude, yet functional, containers for sustenance preparation and storage. They had established a rhythm to their days. Mornings were dedicated to maintaining the fire and assessing the prevailing weather conditions. If the atmospheric state permitted, they would inspect their trapping lines and collect firewood. Afternoons were allocated to food preparation, furthering improvements to their dwelling, and educational pursuits encompassing reading, arithmetic, and storytelling. Evenings involved tending to the fire, making preparations for the night, and cherishing the quiet fellowship of a mother and daughter who had cultivated a profound reliance upon one another. Absolutely. "I sense that spring is imminent," Celia announced one morning, standing at the cave's opening. "Listen." Honora joined her and discerned it. The gentle patter of melting snow, a sound unheard for months. It was an unassuming sound, yet it resonated with the promise of renewal. "Yes," she affirmed, "spring is on its way. What shall we undertake when it arrives?" This was the question Honora had been deferring. Spring signified potential. It meant they possessed the liberty to travel, to seek out a populated area, and to reintegrate into societal norms. It also entailed relinquishing this haven they had painstakingly established, this cavern that had shielded them through the most severe winter of their lives. "We now have options," Honora stated deliberately. "We could relocate to a town and secure employment. I could undertake mending or laundry. You could attend school. However, we also have the option to remain." Celia interjected. "Could we not?" Honora surveyed their cave dwelling. She envisioned the small garden she could cultivate in the clearing outside once spring arrived. The berry-producing shrubs she had identified in the forest, presently dormant but poised to bear fruit. The stream that would flow with fresh, clear water once the ice receded. She contemplated the existence they could forge here, unconventional yet liberated, demanding yet honorable. Yes, she conceded, we could also stay. As winter's frigid embrace finally began to loosen its hold, Honora reached a decision. They would remain through the spring and summer seasons, focusing on constructing a more substantial shelter, establishing a cultivated garden, and making thorough preparations for the ensuing winter. If, by autumn, their inclination was to depart, they would be at liberty to do so. However, this locale had been their salvation, and there was an inherent dignity in choosing to remain, in embracing the life they had meticulously constructed, rather than reverting to a world that had unceremoniously cast them aside. She commenced formulating plans for their summer undertakings, a proper entryway, a designated garden plot, and perhaps even a modest lean-to structure for enhanced storage. She would require implements, which necessitated a future expedition to a settlement, but they could exchange pelts and possibly medicinal herbs for their needs. Their requirements were minimal. The final vestiges of snow descended one night in late March. Honora and Celia stood at the cave's entrance, observing the gentle descent of the flakes, illuminated by the warm glow of the firelight. Behind them, the cave exuded warmth and order, each possession occupying its designated spot, every nook serving a distinct purpose. They had transformed a mere aperture in the rock face into a cherished home, and in so doing had undergone a profound personal metamorphosis. "I am thankful he departed from us," Celia remarked suddenly, prompting a sharp intake of breath from Honora. "My sweet child." "I truly am," Celia insisted. "Had he not forsaken us, we would never have discovered this sanctuary. We would not have acquired the knowledge we now possess. We would remain unaware of our inherent strength." Honora knelt beside her daughter, gazing into eyes that reflected a maturity far exceeding their 7 years. "You are quite correct," she affirmed. "We would not comprehend." That night, they slept soundly upon their fur-lined sleeping platform, the fire burning low and steadily, the wind a muted whisper beyond their carefully constructed refuge. Outdoors, winter was drawing its last breath. Within, 2 resilient mountain women rested, secure in the dwelling they had created and the fortitude they had unearthed. Spring would usher in new adversities, fresh choices, and further explorations, but they had triumphed over the winter, not merely through endurance, but through diligent construction, creative endeavor, and flourishing existence. The cavern at Crow's Peak would stand as a silent witness long after their temporal presence had ceased. Their handprints upon the wall, alongside those of progenitors unknown, would serve as a perpetual testament to humanity's inherent capacity for resilience, adaptability, and enduring hope. In the morning, there would be tasks to attend to. But tonight, Honora and Celia simply existed within the space they had claimed, transformed, and made unequivocally their own. They had been abandoned, left to perish in the desolate winter wilderness. Instead, they had thrived. And as Honora drifted into sleep, this profound realization filled her with a sense of deep contentment.